Chapter 11 of Pioneers of the Old South by Mary Johnston. Recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11 Commonwealth and Restoration. On the 30th of January, 1649, before the palace of Whitehall, Charles I of England was beheaded. In Virginia the event fell with a shock. Even those within the colony who were Cromwell's men rather than Charles's men seem to have recoiled from this act. Presently, too, came fleeing royalists from overseas to add their passionate voices to those of the royalists in Virginia. Many came, nobility, clergy, and gentry, men of the first rate. 1,000 are said to have arrived in the year after the King's death. In October the Virginia Assembly met. Parliament men, and now these were walking with head in the air, might regret the execution of the past January, and yet be prepared to assert that with the fall of the kingdom fell all powers and offices named and decreed by the hapless monarch. What was a passionate royalist government doing in Virginia now that England was a commonwealth? The passionate government answered for itself in acts passed by this Assembly. With swelling words, with a tragic accent, it denounced the late happenings in England and all the Roundhead wickedness that led up to them. It proclaimed loyalty to His Sacred Majesty that now is, that is, to Charles Stuart, afterwards Charles II, then a refugee on the Continent. Finally, it enacted that any who defended the late proceedings, or in the least affected to question the undoubted and inherent right of His Majesty that now is to the colony of Virginia, should be held guilty of high treason, and that reporters and divulgers of rumors tending to change of government should be punished even to severity. Berkeley's words may be detected in these acts of the Assembly. In no great time the Cavalier governor conferred with Colonel Henry Norwood, one of the royalist refugees to Virginia. Norwood thereupon sailed away upon a Dutch ship and came to Holland, where he found His Majesty that now is. Here he knelt and invited that same Majesty to visit his dominion of Virginia, and if he liked it, there to rest, sovereign of the Virginian people. But Charles still hoped to be sovereign in England and would not cross the seas. He sent, however, to Sir William Berkeley a renewal of his governor's commission and appointed Norwood Treasurer of Virginia, and said doubtless many gay and pleasant things. In Virginia there continued to appear from England adherents of the Ancien Régime. Men, women, and children came, until to a considerable degree the tone of society rang Cavalier. This immigration, now lighter, now heavier, continued through a rather prolonged period. There came now to Virginia families whose names are often met in the later history of the land. Now Washingtons appear, with Randolphs, Careys, Skipwiths, Broadnaxes, Tylers, Masons, Madisons, Monroes, and many more. These persons are not without means. They bring with them servants. They are in high favor with governor and council. They acquire large tracts of virgin land. They bring in indentured labor. They purchase African slaves. They cultivate tobacco. From being English country gentlemen, they turn easily to become Virginia planters. But the Virginia Assembly had thrown a gauntlet before the victorious Commonwealth, and the Long Parliament now declared the colony to be in contumacy, assembled and dispatched ships against her, and laid an embargo upon trade with the rebellious daughter. In January of 1652, English ships appeared off Point Comfort. 4 commissioners of the Commonwealth were aboard, of whom that strong man Claiborne was one. After issuing a proclamation to quiet the fears of the people, the commissioners made their way to Jamestown. Here was found the indomitable Berkeley and his council in a state of active preparation, cannon trained. But, when all was said, the commissioners had brought wisely moderate terms: submit because submit they must; acknowledge the Commonwealth; and that done, rest unmolested. If resistance continued, there were enough Parliament men in Virginia to make an army. Indentured servants and slaves should receive freedom in exchange for support to the Commonwealth. The ships would come up from Point Comfort, and a determined war would be on. What Sir William Berkeley personally said has not survived, but after consultation upon consultation, Virginia surrendered to the Commonwealth. Berkeley stepped from the governor's chair, retiring in wrath and bitterness of heart to his house at Green Spring. In his place sat Richard Bennett, one of the commissioners. Claiborne was made secretary. King's men went out of office. Parliament men came in. But there was no persecution. In the bland and wide Virginia air, minds failed to come into hard and frequent collision. For all the ferocities of the statute books, acute suffering for difference of opinion, whether political or religious, did not bulk large in the life of early Virginia. The commissioners, after the reduction of Virginia, had a like part to play with Maryland. At St. Mary's, as at Jamestown, they demanded and at length received submission to the Commonwealth. There was here the less trouble owing to Baltimore's foresight in appointing to the office of governor William Stone, whose opinions, political and religious, accorded with those of Revolutionary England. Yet the governor could not bring himself to forget his oath to Lord Baltimore and agree to the demand of the commissioners that he should administer the government in the name of the keepers of the liberties of England. After some hesitation, the commissioners decided to respect his scruples and allow him to govern in the name of the Lord Proprietary, as he had solemnly promised. In Virginia and in Maryland, the Commonwealth and the Lord Protector stand where stood the kingdom and the king. Many are far better satisfied than they were before, and the confirmed royalist consumes his grumbling in his own circle. The old exhausting quarrel seems laid to rest, but within this wider peace breaks out suddenly an interior strife. Virginia would, if she could, have back all her old northward territory. In 1652, Bennett's government goes so far as to petition Parliament to unseat the Catholic Proprietary of Maryland and make whole again the ancient Virginia. The hand of Claiborne, that remarkable and persistent man, may be seen in this. In Maryland, Puritans and Independents were settled chiefly about the rivers Severn and Patuxent, and in a village called Providence, afterwards Annapolis. These now saw their chance to throw off the Proprietary's rule and to come directly under that of the Commonwealth. So thinking, they put themselves into communication with Bennett and Claiborne. In 1654, Stone charged the commissioners with having promoted faction, sedition, and rebellion against the Lord Baltimore. The charge was well founded. Claiborne and Bennett assumed that they were yet parliamentary commissioners empowered to bring all plantations within the Bay of Chesapeake to their due obedience to the Parliament and Commonwealth of England. And they were indeed set against the Lord Baltimore. Claiborne would head the Puritans of Providence, and a troop should be raised in Virginia and march northward. The commissioners actually advanced upon St. Mary's, and with so superior a force that Stone surrendered, and a Puritan government was inaugurated. A Puritan assembly met, debarring any Catholics. Presently it passed an act annulling the Proprietaries' Act of Toleration. Professors of the religion of Rome should be restrained from the exercise thereof. The hand of the law was to fall heavily upon popery, prelacy, or licentiousness of opinion. Thus was intolerance alive again in the only land where she had seemed to die. In England now there was hardly a Parliament, but only the Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. Content with Baltimore's recognition of the Protectorate, Cromwell was not prepared to back, in their independent action, the commissioners of that now dissolved Parliament. Baltimore made sure of this, and then dispatched messengers over seas to Stone, bidding him do all that lay in him to retake Maryland. Stone thereupon gathered several hundred men and a fleet of small sailing craft, with which he pushed up the bay to the Severn. In the meantime the Puritans had not been idle, but had themselves raised a body of men and had taken over the Golden Lion, an armed merchantman lying before their town. On the 24th of March, 1655, the two forces met in the battle of the Severn. "In the name of God, fall on!" cried the men of Providence, and "Hey for St. Mary's!" cried the others. The battle was won by the Providence men. They slew or wounded 50 of the St. Mary's men, and desperately wounded Stone himself, and took many prisoners, 10 of whom were afterwards condemned to death, and 4 were actually executed. Now followed a period of up and down, the commissioners and the Proprietary alike appealing to the Lord Protector for some expression of his determinate will. Both sides received encouragement, inasmuch as he decided for neither. His own authority being denied by neither, Cromwell may have preferred to hold these distant factions in a canceling, neutralizing posture. But far weightier matters, in fact, were occupying his mind. In 1657, weary of her very sad, distracted, and unsettled condition, Maryland herself proceeded, Puritan, Prelatist, and Catholic together, to agree henceforth to disagree. Toleration, viewed in retrospect, appears dimly to have been seen for the angel that it was. Maryland would return to the Proprietary's rule, provided there should be complete indemnity for political offenses and a solemn promise that the Toleration Act of 1649 should never be repealed. This, without a smile, Baltimore promised. Articles were signed, a new Assembly composed of all manner of Christians was called, and Maryland returned for a time to her first allegiance. Quiet years on the whole follow in Virginia under the Commonwealth. The 3 governors of this period, Bennett, Digges, and Matthews, are all chosen by the Assembly, which, but for the navigation laws, might almost forget the home government. Then Oliver Cromwell dies, and after an interval, back to England come the Stuarts. Charles II is proclaimed king, and back into office in Virginia is brought that staunch old monarchist, Sir William Berkeley, first by a royalist assembly, and presently by commission from the new king. Then Virginia had her long Parliament or Assembly. In 1661, in the first gush of the Restoration, there was elected a House of Burgesses so congenial to Berkeley's mind that he wished to see it perpetuated. For 15 years, therefore, he held it in being, with adjournments from one year into another, and with sharp refusals to listen to any demand for new elections. Yet this demand grew, and still the governor shut the door in the face of the people and looked imperiously forth from the window. His temper, always fiery, now burned vindictive. His zeal for king and church and the high prerogatives of the governor of Virginia became a consuming passion. When Berkeley first came to Virginia, and again for a moment in the flare of the Restoration, his popularity had been real. but for long now it had dwindled. He belonged to an earlier time, and he held fast to old ideas that were decaying at the heart. A bigot for the royal power, a man of class, with a contempt for the generality and its clumsily expressed needs, he grew in narrowness as he grew in years. Berkeley could in these later times write home, though with some exaggeration, "I thank God there are no free schools nor printing, and I hope we shall not have these 100 years, for learning has brought disobedience into the world, and printing has divulged them, and libels against the best governments. God keep us from both." But that was the soured zealot for absolutism. William Berkeley, the man, was fond enough of books, and himself had written plays. The spirit of the time was reactionary in Virginia as it was reactionary in England. Harsh servant and slave laws were passed. A prison was to be erected in each county. Provision was made for pillory and stocks and ducking stool. The Quakers were to be proceeded against. The Baptists who refused to bring children to baptism were to suffer. Then at last in 1670 came restriction of the franchise. Act III. Election of burgesses by whom? Whereas the usual way of choosing burgesses by the votes of all persons who, having served their time, are freemen of this country, who, having little interest in the country, do oftener make tumults at the election to the disturbance of His Majesty's peace, than by their discretions in their votes provide for the conservation thereof, by making choice of persons fitly qualified for the discharge of so great a trust. And whereas the laws of England grant a voice in such election only to such as by their estates, real or personal, have interest enough to tie them to the endeavor of the public good, it is hereby enacted that none but freeholders and housekeepers, who only are answerable to the public for the levies, shall hereafter have a voice in the election of any burgesses in this country. 3 years later another woe befell the colony. That same Charles II, to whom in misfortune Virginia had so adhered that for her loyalty she had received the name of the Old Dominion, now granted all that entire tract, territory, region, and dominion of land and water commonly called Virginia, together with the territory of Accomac, to Lord Culpeper and the Earl of Arlington. For 31 years they were to hold it, paying to the King the slight annual rent of 40 shillings. They were not to disturb the colonists in any guaranteed right of life or land or goods, but for the rest they might farm Virginia. The country cried out in anger. The Assembly hurried commissioners on board a ship in port and sent them to England to besiege the ear of the King. Distress and discontent increased with good reason among the mass of the Virginians. The King in England, his councilors and Parliament, played an unfatherly role, while in Virginia economic hardships pressed ever harder and the administration became more and more oppressive. By 1676 the gunpowder of popular indignation was laid right and left, awaiting the match. End of Chapter 11.